Hey everyone, this is a section from Baruch Knei-Paz's The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. It's titled The Jewish Question, Nationalism and Internationalism. Trotsky's views on the Jewish question may be properly considered at this point in our study, both because Trotsky's views on the Jewish question concern a subject which, on the face of it, is related to the biographical fact of Trotsky's own Jewish birth, and because the subject itself is in the nature of a historical phenomenon, not to say dilemma. These views, though they occupy a marginal place in Trotsky's thought and writings, and though Trotsky's views on the Jewish question offer little that is original or unexpected, are of interest since Trotsky's views on the Jewish question vividly illustrate the nature of Trotsky's internationalist convictions, and throw further light on his unwavering conception of Marxism as a universalist creed. Before giving an account of Trotsky's views on the Jewish question, two related topics may be briefly raised. The one concerns the question of the role of influence of Trotsky's Jewishness in Trotsky's life. On the other, the extent to which Trotsky's thought in general, and Trotsky's views on Jewish questions in particular, were affected by this Jewishness, or can be seen to have reflected this Jewishness. Footnote: in what follows, the term, quote, Jewishness, end quote, is used to signify the simple fact that Trotsky was a Jew by birth, and to a certain extent by upbringing. It is not in itself meant to imply the existence of a Jewish cultural or other identity or consciousness. The latter is precisely the issue involved in the first major topic. End footnote. As to the first of these topics, it seems best to make short shrift of it here, and not only because it is primarily a biographical issue and a speculative biographical issue at that, and therefore outside the scope of the present study. The truth of the matter is that there is very little in Trotsky's life which shows that Trotsky's Jewishness played any significant conscious role in Trotsky's development, that in any direct sense it could be said to have constituted a motive in force in Trotsky's life. This is not to deny that at certain points in Trotsky's life he took the fact of his Jewishness into account, or that at others Trotsky was reminded of it, nor is it to claim that he was completely insensitive to his Jewish background. No Jew, if we bear in mind the climate which prevailed in Russia before and after 1917, could remain altogether indifferent to that Jew's Jewishness. However much that Jew might have wished to do so. It is, however, too much to assume that the fact alone of Jewishness is sufficient cause for a man's life, or a large part of it, to be governed by Jewish self-awareness, much less by what is commonly known as the, quote, Jewish complex, end quote, or that this fact must be reflected in all his exterior behavior and inner tribulations. It is, of course, true that Trotsky's involvement in the Russian revolutionary movement, like the large and disproportionate involvement of other Jews, is significant from the point of view of general sociological observations about the history of the Jews in Russia at the turn of the 20th century. The participation of so many Jews was certainly not accidental, and it is instructive to investigate its sources and its nature, as well as its impact upon the history of the revolutionary movement. Footnote: the best brief account of this kind is Leonard Shapiro, quote, The Role of the Jews in the Russian Revolutionary Movement, end quote, published in the Slavonic and East European Review. The most definitive account of the history and conditions of Jews in Russia is S.M. Dubnov, History of the Jews in Russia and Poland, 3 volumes, published between 1916 and 1920. End footnote. Where am I? But it is a common fallacy to derive conclusions about a particular individual from general observations about the, quote, sociological, end quote, group to which that individual ostensibly belongs. In some cases, what is true about the group may be true about the individual. In others, there is only the most tenuous of relationships. The cause of Trotsky belongs to the latter category. The case of Trotsky belongs to the latter category, the most tenuous of relationships. Nevertheless, probably more nonsense has been written about the, quote, Jewish aspect, end quote, of Trotsky's life than about any other. Footnote: see, for example, Joseph Nadava's Trotsky and the Jews, published in 1972. Another equally dubious attempt at inferring a, quote, Jewish complex, end quote, in Trotsky's life is the Encounter article mentioned previously in other contexts by Joel Carmichael. It is, however, also possible to exaggerate in the opposite direction. Deutscher, for example, in all 3 volumes of his biography of Trotsky, hardly mention Trotsky's writings on Jewish questions and relegates largely to a footnote Trotsky's more moderate remarks on Zionism in the 1930s, as well as even Trotsky's condemnation of Stalin's anti-Semitism. End footnote. This is surprising since Trotsky never revealed any ambiguity or uneasiness about his Jewishness. Trotsky took his Jewishness for what his Jewishness was, a fact of birth and a certain particular upbringing during the early years of his childhood. Trotsky neither concealed his Jewish background nor conversely attempted to attribute to his Jewish background any special significance, whether positive or negative. There was nothing in Trotsky which ever vaguely resembled the kind of ambivalence bordering on perhaps reaching self-hatred which may be found in some of Marx's writings on Jewish questions, nor the intense sense of Jewish nationalism which, being disappointed, finally also ends in self-rejection, as in the case of Lassalle. Footnote: Marx's most extreme definition of the Jewish condition, which being so extreme has engendered the view that Marx was giving vent to more than just socioeconomic opinions, and moreover that he was abnormally sensitive about his background in spite of the fact that, as his father had converted, he had not been brought up as a Jew, is his quote, On the Jewish Question, end quote, in T.B. Baltimore's edited volume, Marx's Early Writings. But in his behavior as well, Marx displayed hostility towards all things Jewish. This has been sometimes overstated, as in M. Glickson's The Jewish Complex of Karl Marx, published in 1961, but seems undeniable. See Asaya Berlin, Karl Marx, His Life and Environment, 3rd edition, London, 1963. On Lassalle's transformation from Jewish nationalist to Jewish deprecator, see Edmund Silberner, Ferdinand Lassalle, from Maccabeism to Jewish anti-Semitism, published in the Hebrew Union College Annual, 1952-53. On the history of anti-Semitism within the Western socialist movement, see the same authors, The Anti-Semitic Tradition in Modern Socialism, published in 1953. End footnote. In his autobiography, Trotsky recounted openly, and it seems fairly and accurately, the nature of Trotsky's Jewish upbringing. Trotsky's parents were neither religious nor particularly observant of Jewish traditions. Trotsky never mastered Yiddish or Hebrew, neither of which was spoken in the home, and although Trotsky received some instruction in Jewish subjects, this was on the whole very limited in scope and of short duration. Even if we assume that Trotsky in Trotsky's autobiography understated early Jewish influences, there are objective reasons for believing that early Jewish influences would have been fewer than those prevailing in a normal Jewish environment. Trotsky grew up neither in an urban Jewish milieu or in a Jewish-populated small town, the typical Russian shtetl, but in a rural community, the son of a Jewish farm owner, largely isolated from other Jews. It does not seem unwarranted, therefore, for Trotsky to have claimed that, quote, in my mental makeup, nationality never occupied an independent place as it was felt but little in everyday life, end quote. Trotsky, my life. In later life, of course, Trotsky came into close contact with many Jews, from Julius Martov and Parvis to numerous social democrats in the capitals of Europe, particularly Vienna. Footnote: in Vienna, Trotsky was compelled to close to choose a religion for his children, he quotes his wife's explanation for this. Quote, according to the Austrian law then in force, children up to the age of 14 had to have religious instruction in the faith of their parents. As no religion was listed in our documents, we chose the Lutheran for the children because it was a religion which seemed easier on the children's shoulders as well as their souls, end quote. Nevada has a field day with this. Nadava has a field day with this. Trotsky, Nadava claims, quote, converted, end quote, Trotsky's children, and what is more, to the Lutheran faith, because Karl Marx's father had chosen Lutheranism. In this way, quote, Trotsky might have been trying unconsciously and vicariously to identify himself with his forerunner in the socialist conception, end quote. I think it's Joseph Nadava. End footnote. But the basis for such relationships was always political. During the Revolution, the fact of his Jewishness was no obstacle, although it was exploited by white propaganda. Footnote. Trotsky humorously recalled, however, an episode of recording in a White Guard publication in which a Cossack exclaims, quote, Trotsky is not a Jew, Trotsky is a fighter, he's ours, ... Russian, ... It is Lenin who is a communist, a Jew, but Trotsky is ours, ... End quote. End footnote. And there is only one major instance where Trotsky himself took it into account. This was immediately after the October insurrection when Lenin offered Trotsky the Commissariat of the Interior. Trotsky turned down the offer of the Commissariat of the Interior, arguing that in this position, Trotsky's Jewish origin would, quote, put into our enemies, end quote, put into our enemies' hands an additional weapon, end quote, Trotsky. This, Trotsky explained in his autobiography, was a purely, quote, political consideration, end quote. Instead, Trotsky accepted the Commissariat for Foreign Affairs. It was only many years later, when Stalin had ascended to power, that Trotsky's Jewishness was made into a thinly veiled issue. Quote, anti-Semitism, end quote, Trotsky wrote, quote, raised its head with that of anti-Trotskyism, end quote. Trotsky, My Life. Trotsky rarely spoke or wrote on any issue as a Jew. As far as was possible, Trotsky tried to avoid being categorized as a Jew, except where it was a matter merely of factual origin, and sought to disclaim any relationship between his Jewishness and his revolutionary activities. One senator suggested to Trotsky that he could not ignore the element of national loyalty, that Trotsky must see himself either as a Russian or as a Jew. Trotsky replied, quote, no, you are mistaken, I am a social democrat, and that's all, end quote. Footnote. One exception to this is his speech to be presently referred to against the Bund at the 1903 Congress of the Russian Social Democrats. And next footnote, quoted in Wolff, Three Who Made a Revolution, on another occasion when a Jewish delegation approached Trotsky to defend as a Jew the political rights of Jews following the Bolshevik triumph, Trotsky replied in anger, quote, I am not a Jew, I am an internationalist, end quote. These attitudes have been taken to mean that Trotsky was ambivalent about his Jewishness, if not entirely hostile to his Jewishness, and thus obsessed by his Jewishness to the point of self-denial. Is it not more reasonable to assume, however, that if Trotsky did not wish to be known as a Jewish revolutionary, it was because Trotsky rejected what he took to be, rightly or wrongly, a form of parochialism? Trotsky did not become a Marxist or a revolutionary because of the, quote, Jewish problem, end quote. And it was not only this problem, which Trotsky wished to eliminate through his Marxist revolutionism. Footnote, quote, ... National inequality probably was one of the underlying causes of my dissatisfaction with the existing order, but it was lost among all the other phases of social injustice. It never played a leading part, not even a recognized part, in the list of my grievances, end quote. End footnote. Trotsky did not want, therefore, to be taken for a kind of Jewish representative or spokesman among the revolutionaries, a champion of Jewish causes. To be identified as a Jew by sympathy and inclination, not by origin, meant to Trotsky to be tied to some nation group. Trotsky rejected such ties as Trotsky rejected all nationalism, for Trotsky considered himself an internationalist in, quote, flesh and blood, end quote. For this very reason, neither can Trotsky be seen as an assimilationist, that is, of one who sought to escape his Jewishness by identifying himself with the national environment in which he lived. I don't know if that means being an you could probably be a cosmopolitan assimilationist, I'd imagine, as well. Moreover, Trotsky never spoke harshly or in a derogatory way about Jews or Judaism. Trotsky's strictures against the Jewish religion and nationhood were like his strictures against all religions and nationhoods, and while Trotsky subscribed to the standard Marxist interpretation of the Jewish question, Trotsky never subjected the standard Marxist interpretation of the Jewish question to crude and simplistic formulas. Marx's severe anti-Jewish language is not echoed in Trotsky's writings. Footnote. One can, of course, describe Trotsky as an assimilationist in the sense of one who wishes to erase national distinctions within an international community. There we are. And footnote. As to the question of the influence of Trotsky's Jewishness upon Trotsky's thought and ideas, though these cannot be artificially severed from Trotsky's life and activities, one could perhaps make out a partial case for the view that no one but a Jew, lacking national roots in the Russian environment, could have become so extremely devoted to purely universalist principles, to specifically the notion of the world revolution creating one world community in which ethnic and national differences would play no role. The theme of universalism was, of course, a well-known phenomenon among the Jewish intelligentsia, both in the wake of emancipation in Western Europe and secularization in Eastern Europe. Footnote. It should be remembered, however, that it was not the only theme, and in Eastern Europe in particular, nationalism, in the form of Zionism, was no less a potent force, so that many of Trotsky's Jewish contemporaries, both in time and place, developed very different ideas. Most East European Zionists, however, were also socialists, and many were even Marxists. End footnote. It is certainly one of the most ubiquitous themes in Trotsky's thought. Be that as it may, beyond this general, somewhat abstract element, Trotsky's thought lacks any specifically Jewish themes and any evidently Jewish content or allusions. Footnote. In this connection, compare Trotsky's writings and his person with, for example, those of Axelrod or Martov. On Axelrod, see Abraham Asher, Pavel Axelrod and the Development of Menshevism, and on Martov, see Israel Getzler, Martov, a political biography of a Russian social democrat. End footnote. In part, this may be due to the limited Jewish education which Trotsky received and to the poverty of Trotsky's Jewish cultural heritage. However, it is also due to the fact that Jewishness was not an issue for Trotsky. Trotsky did not agonize over Jewishness. Trotsky did not feel that Trotsky had, in this connection, anything to assert or deny or conceal. In this matter, Trotsky was at peace with himself. If the Jewish question was a problem, the Jewish question was a problem which Trotsky believed could be resolved, like so many other problems, within the framework of a socialist revolution and a socialist society. There is therefore no reason in Trotsky's view why one should assign to the Jewish question prominence over other problems, and no reason why one should suffer from a, quote, complex, end quote, over the Jewish question. We may consequently consider Trotsky's views on the Jewish question as we have his thought in general, without reference to some hidden motives behind them, and without the, in any case, dubious practice of, quote, psychologizing, end quote, them. Here, too, Trotsky's approach is that of a Marxist revolutionary and analyst, not that of a Jew concerned with this problem specifically or in isolation from other issues. As we shall see, he both underestimated the severity of the problem and overestimated the capacity of socialism for dealing with the problem. The fact that Trotsky subsumed the Jewish question under the issue of nationalism and internationalism expressed, on the one hand, the absence in Trotsky of any tension between Trotsky's Jewishness and Trotsky's Marxism. Reading Trotsky's writings on Jewish questions, one would hardly guess that they were written by a Jew. However, the fallacies and misconstructions of Trotsky's analysis expressed also the limits of Trotsky's Marxist approach. In comparison with most other Russian revolutionaries who hardly touched the subject or dealt with the Jewish question only in the context of the, quote, nationalities question, end quote, in general, Trotsky may be said to have written fairly widely on the Jewish question. Footnote: for Lenin's views on this subject, see Lenin on the Jewish Question, published in 1934. For accounts of socialist attitudes to the Jewish question, see, parenthesis, in Hebrew, Edmund Zilberner's Ha-Socialism Ha-Maravi U-Shelet Ha-Hudim, parenthesis, Western Socialism and the Jewish Question, end parenthesis. Yitzhak Meor, Shilat Yehudim ba tnu'at liberalit ve ha-mafe'anit be Russia, 1890 to 1914. The Jewish Question in the Liberal and Revolutionary Movement in Russia, published in Tel Aviv, 1964. End footnote. In absolute terms, however, these writings, mostly brief articles or essays, are sparse. Trotsky certainly did not deal with the matter systematically, and under the general rubric of the Jewish question, Trotsky commented sometimes indiscriminately on its various, though admittedly related aspects: the condition of the Jews, the origins of their social and economic position, anti-Semitism, Jewish organizations, the Bund in particular, and the possible alternative solutions, especially the Zionist solution to the Jewish predicament. It is best, therefore, to treat these aspects collectively, as Trotsky did, and since the Jewish question must be seen in the Jewish question's changing social context, the Jewish question's nature and ramifications under Tsarism were obviously different from those under Stalin. We shall divide Trotsky's writings into two periods, before 1917 and after. It was in 1903 that Trotsky first expressed views on matters concerning the Jewish question, and this was also to be virtually the only time in Trotsky's life that he would speak openly on this or on any other subject in his, quote, capacity, end quote, as a Jew. The occasion was the fateful Second Congress of the Russian Social Democrats. Footnote: earlier in 1903, Trotsky had written an article in which he commented on pogroms against Jews. The, quote, Kishinev pogrom had erupted in April of that year. So, parenthesis, the Kishinev pogrom had erupted in April of that year, 1903, in parenthesis. But this article was less concerned with the situation of Jews than with the general political repercussions of such events. See also Trotsky's later denunciation of the Black Hundreds in the book 1905. and still later, in 1917, of the pogrom phenomenon. End footnote. The first issue to arise at the Congress was the status of the Bund, the social democratic organization of Jewish workers founded in 1897 within the overall social democratic movement. Footnote. For an account of the ties between the two until 1903, see Harold Schuckman, The Relations Between the Jewish Bund and the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, 1897 to 1903, unpublished doctorate thesis. End footnote. The Bund demanded organizational and cultural autonomy as well as the right to be the sole representative of Jewish workers. This was vehemently opposed by Martov and other Jewish Iskraites. One of the latter, Trotsky, delivered some of the most biting remarks against the Bund and against Jewish separatism in general. Footnote. The Bund issue arose before the general issue of party organization and membership and was to lead to the Menshevik-Bolshevik split, that is, before Martov, Trotsky, and Lenin found themselves in different camps. End footnote. End footnote. Trotsky's various remarks on this issue are in something in Russian. Trotsky's words aroused much protest among the Bundists, but Deutscher, parenthesis, in the Prophet Arndt, pages 73 to 76, end parenthesis, exaggerates when Deutscher makes it appear that Trotsky was the focus of the whole controversy. End footnote. Trotsky made it clear that Trotsky was speaking as a Jew, and therefore Trotsky's opposition to the Bund had an added significance. Footnote. Those, quote, Jewish comrades, end quote, Trotsky said, who opposed autonomy for the Bund and who preferred to work within the framework of an all-Russian party, quote, regarded themselves as representatives of the Jewish Proletariat as well, end quote. End footnote. Trotsky lashed out, first at the whole idea of organizational autonomy, arguing that this would only lead to a profusion of national or ethnic groupings within the party and ultimately to a diffusion of its powers. Trotsky rejected equally the notion that only a Jewish organization could mobilize Jewish workers. This, Trotsky claimed, not only betrayed mistrust in non-Jewish socialists, but assumed that socialism could be propagated on the basis of national feelings alone, whereas socialism's actual appeal was founded on internationalist principles. Beyond this, however, Trotsky attacked the whole concept of Jewish cultural autonomy. This, in Trotsky's view, involved not only a matter of safeguarding certain cultural traits, such as language, which was legitimate, it concerned the whole issue of whether nationality should lead a closed, separate existence. Socialism, Trotsky argued, could not reconcile socialism's self to the idea that people should be cut off from each other and therefore at odds with one another because of certain cultural differences. Its goal is to break down barriers between men, and it was consequently opposed to separatism, whether on the party level or that of society at large. The demands of the Bund, therefore, appeared to Trotsky to reflect parochial tendencies and dangers which went beyond merely party organizational considerations. Footnote. See something in Russian, where Trotsky summarized the Bund controversy. Reiterating his arguments at the Congress, Trotsky wrote of the clash between the, quote, universal and the particular, end quote, of the struggle against, quote, provincialism, quote, narrow patriotism, and, quote, parochialism, end quote. Quote, we worked hard and persistently, end quote, Trotsky remarked, quote, to be rid of the Greek political psychology, the narrow-minded patriotism of, quote, their, end quote, cities, and to stand on the state-minded viewpoint, that of the Romans, end quote, Trotsky, end footnote. How far Trotsky expected the Bund to degenerate along these, quote, nationalist, end quote, lines may be seen from an article Trotsky published shortly after the Congress in January 1904, which is devoted partly to the subject of Zionism. From Trotsky's strictures against the Bund, it is not difficult to guess what would be Trotsky's views on Zionism. If the Bund, which after all sought to remain within the social democratic fold and was a revolutionary workers' organization, had become so much of an anathema to him, how much more antagonistic would be Trotsky's attitude towards a movement which made national identity and political independence, in the form of a sovereign territory, the core of its ideology, notwithstanding its devotion to socialist principles. And indeed, in this article, Trotsky defined once and for all, or nearly so, for some 30 years later, he would express a slight change of mind, his hostility towards Zionism, although Trotsky reserved the brunt of his polemic for the Bund, for at this time Trotsky did not take Zionism very seriously. Having apparently followed the Sixth Zionist Congress held in Basel in the summer of 1903, at which the head of the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, had proposed Uganda as a temporary territorial solution, Trotsky mocked at this, quote, demonstration of impotence, end quote. Quote, Herzl promised Palestine but didn't deliver it, end quote. The effect of the proposal at the Congress was indeed to plunge the Zionist movement into a deep crisis. Trotsky was convinced that this was a crisis from which it could not recover. The Zionist shibboleth of a, quote, fatherland, end quote, had been exposed for what it was, the, quote, reactionary dream, end quote, of a quote, shameless adventurer, end quote, who, having failed once, was now desperately groping for a new stratagem with which to delude the Jewish masses. Quote, it is impossible to keep Zionism alive by this kind of trickery. Zionism is exhausted, Zionism's miserable contents, ... Tens of intriguers and hundreds of simpletons may yet continue to support Herzl's adventures, but Zionism as a movement is already doomed to losing all rights to existence in the future. This is as clear as midday, end quote. Trotsky nevertheless discerned a, quote, Zionist left, end quote, which he believed would, quote, inevitably, end quote, join the ranks of the revolutionary movement out of disappointment with the Zionist solution to the Jewish problem. As for the rest of the remnants of, quote, decaying, end quote, Zionism, they would find a home for themselves in the Bund. The latter was more and more becoming a depository for all that was, quote, accidental and, quote, particular among Jews. Competing with Zionism for adherents, it was beginning to resemble Zionism. It could well be that as Zionism disappeared, it would leave behind a successor, quote, but this successor might prove to be the General Jewish Workers' Union in Lithuania, Poland, and Russia, bracket, i.e. the Bund, end bracket, end quote. This was not a very perspicacious article. Zionism did not disappear, and the Bund forever remained a Jewish organization fundamentally different from and opposed to the Zionist movement. Footnote. For a general account of the Zionist movement from its beginnings to the establishment of the State of Israel, see Walter LeCoeur, A History of Zionism, end footnote. Trotsky betrayed a tendency to lump together indiscriminately all manifestations of cultural and national distinctions. Above all, however, Trotsky exposed an inability to appreciate the force of national identification. Trotsky was himself so far removed from any such inclination that Trotsky found it strange that people should want to retain their, quote, particularism, end quote. Much better than this political analysis, however, was Trotsky's analysis of the social conditions of the Jews. After 1904 and until 1914, Trotsky wrote specifically about the Jewish question on 2 occasions only, both in 1913, and in each case it was to unravel its inner social manifestations and its impact upon society at large. Footnote. The only other specific reference to the Jewish question occurs in Trotsky's 1905 article on the State Duma. A brief section of this article is entitled, quote, The Jewish Question, end quote, and merely points out that the granting of political rights to Jews, as well as the alleviation of their conditions, continue to be shirked by the state authorities. End footnote. The first of these, quote, Jewish pieces, end quote, is an article dealing with the condition of Jews in Romania. In 1912 and 1913, Trotsky traveled through the Balkans as the correspondent of the Russian newspaper Kievskaya Misl. The article is one of Trotsky's many reports on social developments in the Balkan countries. Quote, the real Romania, end quote, Trotsky began, quote, manifests itself through the Jewish question, end quote. 300,000 Romanian Jews lived as, quote, foreigners, end quote, without citizenship, without fundamental political rights, but with all these obligations, including army service, which devolve upon citizens. The country, Trotsky continued, was permeated by a hatred of the Jews. Small businessmen feared competition from them. Clerks, professionals, state employees were anxious lest the Jews be granted citizenship and thereby take away their jobs. Teachers and priests, quote, agents, end quote, of the nationalistic landlords, convinced the peasantry that all its misery was due to the Jews. Quote, anti-Semitism is becoming a state religion, the last psychological cementing factor of a feudal society rotten through and through, ... end quote. Trotsky. Why then were the Jews tolerated? Because according to Trotsky, the Romanian regime needed the Jew, firstly to act as the, quote, middleman, end quote, leaseholder, moneylender, hired journalist, end quote, between landowner and peasant, between the politician and his clients, to carry out all the, quote, dirty assignments, end quote. Secondly, to be the focus for the indignation of the dissatisfied Romanian population, to be the perennial scapegoat. Trotsky then went on to give a detailed account of the historical evolution of the Jewish situation in Romania. The gist of this was that the Jews had been turned into a bartering commodity in the hands of cynical international diplomacy and high finance. At the Congress of Berlin in 1878, Western statesmen, and Bismarck in particular, had ostensibly insisted that Romania grant equal rights to Romania's Jews as a precondition to the guarantee of Romania's independence. Very soon, however, it became clear, according to Trotsky, that Bismarck's real interest was the acquisition of Romania at high prices of shares in the Romanian railways held by the German bankers, some of them Jews, whose investments in the railways had culminated in huge losses. As soon as this was settled to the satisfaction of Bismarck and the bankers, the, quote, Jewish precondition, end quote, became a minor matter. Romania granted citizenship to 900 Jews who had fought in the 1876-78 war with Turkey. As for the other, quote, 29,100, end quote, they remained in the same servile condition. Quote, reading the diplomatic papers concerning this case, end quote, Trotsky remarked, quote, as well as the private correspondence of the interested parties involved, one cannot for a moment free oneself of a feeling of deep disgust, end quote. Trotsky. The final section of the article returned to the pitiful conditions of Romanian Jewry and described the extent of the discrimination against Romanian Jews' lack of security, Romanian Jews' uneven social and economic distribution, Romanian Jewry's inability to escape certain prescribed roles arising from legal and social inequality. Quote, the conditions of feudal stagnation, of legal deprivation, political and bureaucratic corruption, not only degrade the Jewish masses economically, but bring about the Jewish masses' spiritual disintegration. There might be endless arguments on the theme that the Jews are a separate nation, but it is an undeniable fact that the Jews do reflect the economic and moral conditions of the country in which the Jews live, and being artificially isolated from the majority of the population, the Jews are nevertheless an integral part of it. End quote. Trotsky. The article ended on a mixed note. Trotsky noted sadly that Romanian Jews had so far been unable to organize themselves effectively for political action. They had formed a, quote, union, end quote, which based its program on ingratiation with the ruling oligarchy and devotion to Romanian patriotism. On the other hand, Trotsky hoped that their lot would yet become bound up with that of progressive opinion and forces throughout Europe. Without question, this article constituted one of Trotsky's best comments on the Jewish question. It was certainly the most openly sympathetic. There is no sense here of a demonstrative detachment. Rather, one feels that Trotsky was almost identifying with the endurers of injustice whom Trotsky described. Moreover, there was in the article no facile economic dismissal of the problem. Though the economic position of the Jews entered into Trotsky's analysis, the Jews were presented as the victims of a social system, not to mention of an international diplomatic maneuver, if not conspiracy, rather than its happy beneficiaries. There is, of course, no reason to believe that Trotsky's empathy for the Jews was any greater for his being a Jew. Trotsky could write with no less compassion about the sufferings of non-Jews as well. Trotsky's identification was with the suffering, not with the identity of the sufferer. But how different was the tone and content of this article, which was in effect a definition of the Judenfrage, Jewish question, from Marx's notorious fulminations on the same subject, exclamation point. At least it put paid to the view, which Marx was as responsible for disseminating among socialists as anybody else, that the Jews were somehow all established capitalists, and that it was capitalism which was the source of anti-Semitism. Footnote. Though Marx was certainly not the first socialist to voice such and other opinions about the Jews, as the examples of Fourier and Proudhon sufficiently testify, in this connection see again Zilberner, the anti-Semitic tradition in modern socialism. End footnote. Even in Western Europe, this is only partially true. As Trotsky's article made clear, it was almost completely groundless as far as the Jews of Romania were concerned, and for that matter those of Russia and Eastern Europe in general. No less compassionate, however, and similarly perceptive about anti-Semitism and the Jewish condition was Trotsky's second 1913 article devoted to a specifically Jewish topic. This was originally published in November of that year in Die Neue Zeit with an analysis of the notorious Beilis trial, in which a Russian Jew of that name was accused of a religious ritual murder. What did I say? Bellis? I meant to say Beilis. Menahem Mendel Beilis lived from 1874 to 1934. Menahem Mendel Beilis was a Russian Jew accused of ritual murder in Kiev in the Russian Empire in a notorious 1913 trial known as the, quote, Beilis trial, or the, quote, Beilis affair. Although Menahem Mendel Beilis was eventually acquitted after a lengthy process, the legal process sparked international criticism of anti-Semitism in the Russian Empire. Menahem Mendel Beilis' story was fictionalized in Bernard Malamud's 1966 novel, The Fixer, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and the U.S. National Book Award for Fiction. Back to the text. This was originally published in November of 1913 in Die Neue Zeit and was an analysis of the notorious Beilis trial, in which a Russian Jew of that same name was accused of a religious ritual murder. For an account of this case and trial, see Maurice Samuel, Blood Accusation, published 1966. End footnote. The article may be considered a classic exercise in mockery and sarcasm, a style not inappropriate to describing the superstitions, the medieval chicanery over biblical references, and the sheer nonsense which are paraded before the court. With Trotsky's sense for the dramatically fantastic, Trotsky could hardly resist exploiting the rich material for ridicule which the trial provided. But the trial, of course, was not a laughing matter as far as the victimized Bialist was concerned, and it reflected the situation not of an isolated individual, but of a whole class of men, the Jews of Russia. In bringing out the absurdities of the trial, as well as the absurd figures who passed through the trial as witnesses, lawyers, jurymen, Trotsky sought to convey the primitive reality of Russian society at its lowest peasant levels as at its highest autocratic levels. This, Trotsky believed, was the crucible of Russian anti-Semitism, ignorance joining hands with viciousness to victimize innocent persons who were declared to be the source of all evil. To bring out the peculiarity of this anti-Semitism, Trotsky compared the Bialist case with the Dreyfus affair in France. Quote, "It cannot be denied that, to a certain extent, an analogy between the two cases exists, but there are also strikingly different from one another, as is the French drawing room Jesuit anti-Semitism from the Russian criminal pogromist Black Hundredism, and as is the cynical and learned Poincaré, who professes not to believe in God or the devil, from the Tsar Nicholas, who has no doubt that witches on brooms take off at night through chimneys." End quote. Trotsky. Back to the text. Oh, wait, no, I didn't leave the text. Sorry, I just changed pages. The trial, Trotsky wrote, aroused in him a, quote, "feeling of physical nausea," end quote. Trotsky believed, however, that its main impact in the end would be to hasten political disgust with the autocracy. In this sense, it will have contributed in its own peculiar way to the revolutionary temper of the times. If Trotsky's writings on the Jewish question during the period before 1917 are few and far between, they are even more sparse during the following decade or so. Generally, in his years of power, Trotsky shied away from Jewish matters and considered their marginality to his active concerns. There is nothing sinister in this, but probably the reluctance not to appear as the spokesman for Jewish causes also played a role in Trotsky's silence. Footnote. Although he sometimes demonstratively disclaimed any special interest in matters of concern to Jews, neither did he oppose Jewish causes simply because they were Jewish. However, some of his activities must have grated on Jewish susceptibilities. Thus, for example, for a year or so in 1921-2, Trotsky headed the, quote, "Society of the Godless," end quote, an organization created to spread anti-religious propaganda and which was, of course, directed against Judaism no less than against Christianity. Or again, when in mid-1922 the Living Church movement came into being. Trotsky encouraged its growth both because it was opposed to the established church hierarchy and because it represented, in his view, a departure from medieval religiosity and the adoption of a more modern, more rational approach to religious practice. In Literature and Revolution, Trotsky described this movement as representing the progressive going over of the church to a new economic policy of its own. Quote, "If the Soviet NEP is a mating of socialist economy with capitalism, then the church NEP is a bourgeois grafting onto the feudal stem," end quote. Trotsky. However, the Living Church aroused among the Orthodox establishment the anti-Semitic charge that the movement was a Jewish conspiracy aimed at undermining Christianity. Parenthesis, see Carr, Socialism in One Country, 1, pages 51-2, note 6, end parenthesis. Trotsky, however, did not hesitate to condemn this expression of anti-Semitism. Trotsky also never seems to have had anything to do with the, quote, Evzektia, end quote, the, quote, Jewish Bureau, end quote, of the Communist Party created to, quote, adapt, end quote, Russian Jewry to the revolution. All in all, it may be said of Trotsky that, rightly or wrongly, Trotsky considered his Jewishness to be an irrelevant factor. Other Russian Jews, of course, did not see matters in the same light. In 1921, Rabbi Jacob Mays, the chief rabbi of Moscow, approached Trotsky on behalf of the Russian Jews. Trotsky told him that he did not see himself as a Jew, but simply as a revolutionary, to which the rabbi retorted, quote, "The Trotskys make the revolutions and the Bronsteins pay the bills," end quote. Parenthesis, quoted in S.M. Malamed, quote, St. Paul and Leon Trotsky, end quote. Reflex, November 1927. End footnote. At any rate, if Trotsky took no interest in the Jewish question, neither did Trotsky have much to say on the wider national question. Trotsky was content to defer in this matter entirely to Lenin, whose views on it Trotsky accepted implicitly. Footnote. For Lenin's views on the national question, see V.I. Lenin something in Russian. On the relation between these views and the Russian question, see On the relation between these views and the Jewish question, see Harold Schuckman, quote, Lenin's nationalities policy in the Jewish question, end quote. Published in Bulletin on Soviet and East European Jewish Affairs, parenthesis, May 1970, end parenthesis, pages 43 to 50. For a detailed account of Soviet policy during Lenin's time towards the nationalities, see Richard Pipes, The Formation of the Soviet Union, Communism and Nationalism, 1917 to 1923, published in 1954. See also Mary Holdsworth's Lenin and the Nationalities Question in Shapiro and Redaway's edited volume, Lenin, the Man, the Theorist, the Leader. End footnote. Quote, the national policy of Lenin, end quote, Trotsky wrote expansively in later years, quote, will find its place among the eternal treasures of mankind, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. The History of the Russian Revolution, Book 3. The phraseology of this sentence is quite unlike Trotsky's usual style, but it reflects again Trotsky's adulatory manner whenever reminiscing about Lenin. The sentence concludes the chapter, devoted to the, quote, problem of nationalities, end quote. The first part of the chapter is intended to show the inability of the provisional government to deal with the nationalities. On page 904 to 913, there is a note which summarizes Lenin's views and which simultaneously derides Stalin's theoretical, quote, pretensions, end quote, in this sphere. See also Trotsky's Stalin, where Trotsky not only throws doubt on Stalin's originality, but asserts that the latter's well-known work on the national question, titled Marxism and the National Question, was largely the work of Lenin. End footnote. Trotsky wrote virtually nothing on this question either before or after 1917. Footnote. For his pre-1917 writings on the national question, see something in Russian, of Trotsky's post-1917 writings, the chapter from The History of the Russian Revolution mentioned above is in effect his only sustained comment on the subject. End footnote. Trotsky believed that the problem of nationalities would naturally resolve itself within the framework of a workers' government, and certainly of a socialist society in which class loyalty would be stronger than national loyalty. Footnote. See Trotsky's defense of the Red Army's invasion of Georgia in 1921, parenthesis, in which Trotsky argued that the principle of national self-determination had to be subordinated, at least during the transition period of the revolution, to the principle of a unified socialist economy. When, in 1923, Lenin asked Trotsky to defend the case of the, quote, national deviationist, end quote, in Georgia against Stalin, Trotsky did so only reluctantly, without much conviction and without success, though in later years Trotsky exaggerated the differences between himself and Stalin on the Georgian issue. See My Life, Book 2. End footnote. Trotsky believed that the problem of nationalities would naturally resolve itself within the framework of a workers' government, and certainly of a socialist society, in which class loyalty would be stronger than national loyalty. Sorry, I think I might have already read that. Beyond this, the matter simply did not interest Trotsky. Footnote. It is, however, interesting to note in this context Trotsky's 1920 article on Lenin, in which Trotsky discussed the latter's, quote, national, Russian, characteristics, end quote. Though asserting the fundamental internationalism of Lenin, Trotsky attributed most of Lenin's revolutionary qualities, and some others as well, to his Russian origins and upbringing and to general environmental influences. There was, of course, a great deal of truth in this, but that it should come from Trotsky, who always eschewed national characterizations in the case of, quote, truly Marxist, end quote, revolutionaries, is surprising. End footnote. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that Trotsky should have made light of the whole Jewish question during the years following the revolution. This problem, too, Trotsky thought would disappear in the course of time. Trotsky was genuinely shocked, therefore, when in 1926 first intimations reached him that his own Jewishness had not remained irrelevant, least of all in the party itself, and that anti-Semitism was now being exploited by supposedly dedicated Soviet communists. This was, of course, part of Stalin's way of undermining the opposition by making conspicuous the fact that so many of the opposition's members were Jews. Learning of this anti-Semitic agitation within the party and outside, Trotsky wrote a letter to Bukharin in which he was hardly able to restrain his surprise, his dismay, and his fury at this development. Footnote. The letter in the archives T868. Trotsky asked Bukharin to join him despite their political differences in verifying the facts behind this agitation. Bukharin, however, apparently chose to avoid the matter, for he did not reply. End footnote. In fact, this was only the beginning of what would become a standard feature of Stalinism, and not only or even mainly as a weapon against Trotsky. Following his exile, the truth of this slowly dawned on Trotsky. In fact, this is only the beginning of what would become a standard feature of Stalinism, and not only or even mainly as a weapon against Trotsky. Following Trotsky's exile, the truth of this slowly dawned on Trotsky, and when it did, he did not hesitate to confront it directly. Of his many observations during the 1930s on the phenomenon of Soviet anti-Semitism, the most interesting was to be an article Trotsky prepared in 1937 entitled Thermidor and Anti-Semitism. Footnote. The article was not published until after Trotsky's death. References are to the English translation in Irving Howe's edited volume, Basic Writings of Trotsky, pages 206 to 215. End footnote. It is interesting for the manner in which Trotsky recognized the intractability of Russian popular anti-Semitism, attempting to link its reemergence with the character of the Soviet regime as he defined it in the 1930s. Thus Trotsky admitted the October Revolution did not, in quote, one blow, end quote, sweep out anti-Semitism. Quote, legislation alone does not change people, end quote. The level of culture, traditions, thoughts, and emotions, all these were stronger than laws, and it was consequently, quote, impossible that national and chauvinist prejudices, particularly anti-Semitism, should not have persisted strongly among the backward layers of the population, end quote. Trotsky then explained, however, that under Stalin, this hostility towards the Jews was expressed in a particular form. The Jews, being largely an urban population, more educated and cultured, were naturally a main source for the large number of civil servants which the Stalin regime needed, and the fact that so many bureaucrats were Jews could not have escaped the notice of the population. Quote, "The hatred of the peasants and the workers for the bureaucracy is a fundamental fact in social life, ... Even by a priori reasoning, it is impossible not to conclude that the hatred of the bureaucracy would assume an anti-Semitic color, at least in those places where the Jewish functionaries compose a significant percentage of the population and are thrown into relief against the broad background of the peasant masses." End quote. Trotsky. This explanation may have served Trotsky's purpose of linking bureaucratism with anti-Semitism, but also imply that anti-Semitism worked against the interests of Stalin and the bureaucracy. Why then should Stalin have been interested in encouraging renewed expression of hostility towards Jews? Trotsky himself seems to have recognized the limits of his explanation, for in the rest of the article he showed that it was not so much the Soviet bureaucracy which bore the brunt of the anti-Semitic venom as the opponents of the bureaucracy. Thus, Trotsky pointed out that the Jewish origin of many accused in the 1930s trials was made conspicuous for all to see. Why was it, Trotsky wondered rhetorically, that the left opposition was made to appear as made up almost exclusively of Jews? Footnote. Trotsky denied, however, that Jews were predominant among its members and pointed to the names of a number of, quote, fully indigenous Russians, end quote. Parenthesis, e.g. Smirnov, Preobrazhensky, end parenthesis, end footnote. Why was it that Trotsky was suddenly being identified as Bronstein, not Trotsky, and Zinoviev as Radomilsky, Kamenev as Rosenfeld? Footnote. In this connection, Trotsky recalled his 1926 letter to Bukharin and the latter's failure to intervene. End footnote. In fact, Trotsky made it clear that it was the old Bolshevik guard against which Stalin was struggling that was being discredited by the means of anti-Semitism, that moreover the bureaucracy, faced by insuperable economic difficulties, strove to, quote, divert the indignation of the working masses from itself to the Jews, end quote. Finally, Trotsky noted the, quote, Thermidorian reaction, end quote, was accompanied by, quote, the most unbridled chauvinistic passions, anti-Semitism among them, end quote. On his own showing, therefore, the bureaucracy was more the beneficiary of popular anti-Semitism than its victim, and, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, which, as he had always argued, must lead to bureaucratization, could be paraded as a nationalist ideology. The opponents of which would be defined as non-indigenous by origin. Trotsky was not blind, therefore, to some of the real sources of Soviet anti-Semitism, and the fact that Trotsky nevertheless attempted to see the existence itself of the bureaucracy as a cause of popular anti-Semitism may be attributed to Trotsky's hope that the, quote, peasants and workers, end quote, were implacably hostile to bureaucratism as such. Footnote. In Stalin, Trotsky implied that Stalin was personally anti-Semitic, but that he always used anti-Semitism in a, quote, calculated, end quote, manner. End footnote. The more specific issue of Soviet policy towards Jews to which Trotsky addressed himself on a number of occasions was that of Birobidzhan, the area designated in 1934 as a Jewish autonomous region. According to Wikipedia, the Jewish Autonomous Oblast is a federal subject of Russia in the far east of the country, bordering Khabarovsk Krai and Amur Oblast in Russia and Heilongjiang province in China. Its administrative center is the town of Birobidzhan. The Jewish Autonomous Oblast was designated by a Soviet official decree in 1928 and officially established in 1934. At its height in the late 1940s, the Jewish population in the region peaked around 46,000, 50,000, approximately 25% of its population. By 1959, its Jewish population had fallen by half, and by 1989, with emigration restrictions removed, Jews made up 4% of its population. By 2000, according to census data, there were only approximately 1,600 people of Jewish descent remaining in the Jewish Autonomous Oblast, or just under 1% of the total population of the Jewish Autonomous Oblast, and around 1% of Jews in the country, while ethnic Russians made up 93% of its population. According to the 2021 census, there are only 837 ethnic Jews left in the Jewish Autonomous Oblast. Article 65 of the Constitution of Russia provides that the Jewish Autonomous Oblast is Russia's only autonomous oblast. It is one of two officially Jewish jurisdictions in the world, the other being Israel. It is also the only territory in the world where Yiddish is an official language. Back to the text. The more specific issue of Soviet policy towards Jews to which Trotsky addressed himself on a number of occasions was that of Birobidzhan, the area designated in 1934 as a Jewish autonomous region. Footnote. On the history of this experiment, see, in Hebrew, Jacob Levavi, the Jewish settlement in Birobidzhan. On the condition in general of the Jews in the Soviet Union, see Solomon Schwartz, The Jews in the Soviet Union. Solomon Schwartz also, I believe, wrote a very important book on labor in the Soviet Union. End footnote. In principle, Trotsky appeared to favor the idea of an independent cultural community within the framework of the Soviet Federation. In a letter of 1934, Trotsky wrote that a, quote, workers' government is duty-bound to create for the Jews, as for any nation, the very best circumstances for cultural development, end quote. And Trotsky added, quote, this means inter alia, to provide for those Jews who desire to have their own schools, their own press, their own theater, etc., a separate territory for self-administration and development. The international proletariat will behave in the same way when it will become the master of the whole globe. In the sphere of the national question, there must be an all-sided material assistance for the cultural needs of all nationalities and ethnic groups. If this or that national group is doomed to go down, in the national sense, then this must proceed in the same way as a natural process, but never as a consequence of any territorial, economic, or administrative difficulties. End quote. Trotsky. The source for this letter, a reply to a group of Jewish oppositionists in the Soviet Union, is the pamphlet Leon Trotsky on the Jewish Question, published by the Pathfinder Press. The Russian original has not been traced. End footnote. Trotsky repeated the same view in the piece Thermidor and Anti-Semitism, though Trotsky here added the idea of Birobidzhan. The idea of Birobidzhan was in any case a temporary solution, necessary so long as nations as independent cultural entities continue to exist, and until a truly international socialist community was created. However, as far as the actual Birobidzhan project was concerned, this appeared to Trotsky to reflect, quote, all the vices of bureaucratic despotism, end quote, and elsewhere Trotsky defined it as, quote, a bureaucratic farce, end quote. One second. Of course, the solution to the Jewish problem had become in the 1930s a matter of urgency, not primarily because of the conditions of Jews in the Soviet Union. It was the situation in Germany which had raised anew the question whether, after all, the only way of saving the Jews of Europe was the Zionist way. Did Trotsky, as a consequence, become more amenable to the Zionist solution? The most that can be said is that his position became less obviously hostile, though even this must be qualified. In 1934, Trotsky told an interviewer that he remained, quote, opposed to Zionism and all such forms of self-isolation, end quote. Footnote. On the Jewish problem in Leon Trotsky and on the Jewish question. Parenthesis. This interview first appeared in the journal Class Struggle, February 1934, end parenthesis. End footnote. The Jewish question, Trotsky said, could not, quote, be solved within the framework of capitalism, end quote. Trotsky did not know, quote, whether Jewry would be built up again as a nation, end quote. Quote, however, end quote, Trotsky added, quote, there can be no doubt that the material conditions for the existence of Jewry as an independent nation could be brought about only by the proletarian revolution, ... The establishment of a territorial base for Jewry in Palestine or any other country is conceivable only with the migration of large human masses. Only a triumphant socialism can take upon itself such tasks, end quote. Trotsky. Either some mutual understanding would be reached between Arabs and Jews in Palestine, or, quote, a kind of international proletarian tribunal, end quote, would, quote, take up this question and solve it, end quote. Footnote. Asked whether Arab riots in 1929 against Jews in Palestine represented a, quote, uprising of oppressed masses, end quote, Trotsky replied that he did not know enough about the subject to determine to what degree, quote, elements such as national liberationists, parenthesis, anti-imperialists, end parenthesis, end quote, were present, and to what degree, quote, reactionary Mohammedans and anti-Semitic pogromists, end quote, were involved, end footnote. In all this, there was some implication that Trotsky was prepared to at least entertain the idea of a Jewish national home, perhaps even in Palestine. In 1937, this implication became stronger yet. In an interview with correspondents of Yiddish newspapers, the issue of Zionism, and specifically a territorial solution, was raised again. Footnote. Interview with Jewish Telegraphic Agency on the 18th of January 1937, published in Yiddish in Vorwärts, not spelled like in the way that we spell it when you're talking about the German Social Democratic periodical, but it looks like what it's saying. Vorwärts, pages 1 and 9, under the headline "Jews Must Have a Land," Trotsky declares. An English translation is in Leon Trotsky on the Jewish Question, pages 20 to 22. End footnote. What Trotsky had to say on this occasion has been the source of different interpretations and is therefore worth quoting at length. Trotsky opened by regretting the fact that he did not know Yiddish, as a result of which Trotsky could not follow the Yiddish press and could not be fully informed of the many aspects of the Jewish question. Trotsky then stated the following, quote, during my youth, I rather leaned toward the prognosis that the Jews of different countries would be assimilated and that the Jewish question would thus disappear in a quasi-automatic fashion. The historical development of the last quarter of a century has not confirmed this perspective. Decaying capitalism has everywhere swung over to an exacerbated nationalism, one part of which is anti-Semitism, ... On the other hand, the Jews of different countries have created their press and developed the Yiddish language as an instrument adapted to modern culture. One must therefore reckon with the fact that the Jewish nation will maintain itself for an entire epoch to come. Now the nation cannot normally visit with a common territory. Now the nation cannot normally exist without a common territory. Zionism springs from this very idea. But the facts of every passing day demonstrate to us that Zionism is incapable of resolving the Jewish question. The conflict between the Jews and Arabs in Palestine acquires more and more tragic and more menacing character. I do not at all believe that the Jewish question can be resolved within the framework of rotting capitalism and under the control of British imperialism. And how, you ask me, can socialism solve this question? On this point I can offer but hypotheses. Once socialism has become master of our planet, at least for its most important sections, it will have unimaginable resources in all domains. Human history has witnessed the epoch of great migrations on the basis of barbarism. Socialism will open the possibility of great migration on the basis of the most developed technique and culture. It goes without saying that what is here involved is not compulsory displacement, that is, the creation of new ghettos for certain nationalities, but displacements freely consented to, or rather demanded by certain nationalities or parts of nationalities. The dispersed Jews who would want to be reassembled in the same community will find a sufficiently extensive and rich spot under the sun. The same possibility will be open for the Arabs as for all other scattered nations. National topography will become a part of the planned economy. This is the grand historical perspective that I envisage. To work for international socialism means also to work for the solution of the Jewish question, end quote. Trotsky. The only certain, footnote, for a somewhat different, though not in essence, version of this interview based on the account of another correspondent, see Vorwärts, 28th of January, 1937. Footnote. End footnote. The only certain conclusion which can be reached on the basis of this statement is that Trotsky now recognized both the catastrophic urgency of the Jewish problem and the persistent vitality of Jewish culture and peoplehood. Trotsky remained opposed to the ideology of Nazism, though Trotsky may have now become convinced that a territory to which Jews could emigrate might prevent their destruction in Europe. At the end of the interview, Trotsky spoke of Zionism as a, quote, palliative, end quote. In this limited sense, Trotsky may have thought it to be necessary at that particular moment in history. Indeed, the measure of Trotsky's concern for the fate of Jews may be gauged from a warning he gave at the end of 1938, quote, even without war, the next development of world reaction signifies with certainty the physical extermination of the Jews, end quote. Quote, even without war, the next development of world reaction signifies the physical extermination of the Jews, end quote. If this was the prospect, then a territorial solution was certainly preferable. But Zionism, Trotsky argued, could not solve the problem in the long run. Firstly, because of the conflict with the Arabs. Secondly, because the Jewish problem was inextricably bound up with the future of capitalist society. Footnote. Trotsky's last comment on the Jewish question is a brief note written in July 1940. It reads as follows, quote, the attempt to solve the Jewish question through the migration of Jews to Palestine can now be seen for what it is, a tragic mockery of the Jewish people, interested in winning the sympathies of the Arabs who are more numerous than the Jews. The British government has sharply altered its promise to help them found their new, quote, own home, end quote, in a foreign land. The future development of military events may well transform Palestine into a bloody trap for several 100,000 Jews. Never was it so clear as it is today that the salvation of the Jewish people is bound up inseparably with the overthrow of the capitalist system. End quote, Trotsky. on the Jewish Problem, published in Fourth International, December 1945. Trotsky had been wrong, he admitted, about the strength of Jewish consciousness, and it may be that the desire for a territorial community would need to be satisfied in the long run as well, but this could be realized in a realistic and peaceful way only within the framework of the final collapse of capitalism everywhere and the emergence of a socialist world. Quote, the very same methods, end quote, Trotsky wrote, quote, of dissolving the Jewish question which under decaying capitalism have a utopian and reactionary character, Zionism, and will under the regime of socialist federation take on a real and salutary meaning, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky thus continued to urge Jews, and especially, of course, Jewish workers, to tie their future to the revolutionary socialist movement. Trotsky warned them against cutting themselves off from, quote, progressive, end quote, elements throughout the world. Trotsky remained convicted that the Jews on their own could not save themselves, either within the framework of independent organizations in countries where they lived, or by way of a national state. Footnote. In the early 1930s, Trotsky called on Jewish workers' organizations in France and the United States not to remain outside the framework of the workers' movements of their countries. Parenthesis, this was exactly like his advice to the Bund in 1903. And parenthesis, see the piece Letter to Chlorkeit and to the Jewish workers in France, end quote, in Leon Trotsky on the Jewish Question, and the piece Greetings to Unser Kampf. End footnote. Trotsky refused, therefore, to reconcile themselves to what, in 1983, he called the, quote, particularistic, end quote, and he persisted in putting forward the internationalist view and approach. Yet Trotsky had obviously erred in his estimate of the force of Jewish nationalism, and he had underestimated as well the potentialities of Zionism as a solution to the Jewish problem. In view of the catastrophe which befell the Jewish people during the period of the Second World War, in view also of the nearly total failure of the socialist movement to become the international force that Trotsky had hoped it would, Zionism proved to be a more realistic response to the Jewish predicament than any other conceivable and conceived solution. That Trotsky could not see this or could not reconcile himself to it until very late, and even then only partially, may have reflected on the one hand Trotsky's personal independence of national ties and sentiments, however also pointed up to the limits of purely Marxist analysis of social communities, which left out of account the reality of solidarity based on elements other than those of economic class. The absence in Trotsky himself of any tension, much less conflict between international sentiments and national roots, did not reflect the situation among Jews in general. Footnote. That the conflict between the State of Israel and the Arabs is not resolved after more than a quarter of a century does not invalidate Zionism as a solution to the Jewish problem as it exists in Europe or in the diaspora in general, which is the problem to which Trotsky, like others, had to address himself. And the persistence of this conflict is perhaps further confirmation of the power of national sentiments on both sides, as against international or, quote, class, end quote, ones, though this would be to simplify the nature of the conflict. End footnote. Trotsky's writings on the Jewish question should not therefore be seen in isolation from Trotsky's other writings or his views in general. They are quite simply a particular example of his overall hostile attitude towards nationalism, even towards national consciousness alone, and of his consistent commitment to the principles of internationalism. Footnote. There appear to be, however, one surprising exception to this, and it concerns his views on the Negro question in the United States. In 1939, Trotsky and some of his American followers held a number of discussions of this question. Trotsky supported the idea of Negro nationalism and self-determination, even an independent Negro state, so much so, in fact, that one has the impression of reading the words of a contemporary proponent of black power. These views, however, become less surprising when one looks at the motives behind them as expressed by Trotsky in the discussions. Disappointed by the conservative character of the American working class, Trotsky believed that it was the Negroes who were potentially the most radical element in America. A Negro movement demanding self-determination would, in Trotsky's view, make for a powerful jolt to American society. Trotsky's position, therefore, was not unlike that of Lenin before 1917 on self-determination for the nationalities in the Russian Empire, i.e. support for self-determination not in principle, but a means of accelerating the breakup of the empire. As the discussions make clear, Trotsky's position was also tactical, to use Negro nationalism for wider revolutionary aims. Trotsky obviously was not always averse to political opportunism, and it may here be said he had learnt and imbibed well his Leninism. See the pieces Minutes of Discussion on the Negro Question in Archives T351II, Self-Determination of the American Negroes in T4561, A Negro Question T4562, and Plans for the Negro Organization 24563. All these discussions were held in English. End footnote. If during the 1930s in particular Trotsky frequently wrote and spoke about the Jewish question, this is not because of any special personal interest or any basic change in his attitudes. In part, it was occasioned by the situation in the Soviet Union. In general, however, it was a response to what had become one of the central and ultimately tragic problems of Europe. The, quote, Jewish question, end quote, Trotsky wrote, quote, has never occupied the center of my attention, but that does not mean that I have the right to be blind to the Jewish problem, which exists and demands solution, end quote. Trotsky. That's from the piece Thermidor and Anti-Semitism. This is the end of the piece on Trotsky, the section of Baruch Knei-Paz's The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky on the Jewish question. Thanks for listening.